Our next speaker is my good colleague at Comparative Politics in Bergen, Per Selle. He has jointly been in charge of the Norwegian part of the very huge international comparative Johns Hopkins project on the non-profit sector. And he was also, relatively recently, a member of the group leading the most recent Norwegian Power and Democracy project, a huge Norwegian social science project. Per's research covers also a broad spectrum of topics, ranging from the study of the Communist Party of Norway. I guess this is more a topic for historians now. Voluntary organizations and the welfare state, environmental movements, political culture, indigenous politics, and democratic theory. To give you a flavor of his research, I mentioned some of the titles of his recent articles and some of his books, some of which are co-authored. One book on cultural theory as political science, government and voluntary organizations, which we co-edited, civil society in transition, organizational change and globalization, the rise and fall of popular mass movements, organizational change and globalization, and one book on unique environmentalism, a comparative perspective. And today he will talk about a social democratic model of civil society and the welfare state. Question mark, I'm happy about the question mark. The Nordic case, please.
Those nice words, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting seminar in honor of Professor Kocka. I don't really know where I should end this short talk, but I know where I should start, or where I start. I start with a new interest, I think, in the Nordic model. There's been an interest in the Nordic model before, of course, and then we had I would say 20 years period with not that much interest. There was some kind of backwards or something, some strange people living up north. But if you look at the World Economic Forum this year, the Nordic model is up front. And it's up front in a broader context than the welfare state civil society relations that I will talk a little bit more about later on. Now it's about how come that the Nordic countries are so good in what they define as crisis management, with the Swedes in the 90s, Norwegians in the 80s, and the Finns, of course, these huge problems, and then it takes 5-10 years and they are in there again. What is this? They're talking about in this forum this cooperative tradition that you find in the Norwegian or Scandinavian or Nordic or whatever you define these countries. And they start to become interested in the trust dimension. Why do these people up north really trust other people and even trust their public and other types of institutions to a greater extent than anywhere else, to a certain extent except for the Netherlands? What is this? Of course, I will not answer that here in this short speak. But what I would say is that it has something to do with civil society. This has something to do with civil society. And even if it's been a lot of research on civil society and on the relationship between civil society and the state and the welfare state, even the relationship between civil society and the welfare state, we don't really understand this very well. So that is why I think we should go into this research area again and try to develop huge projects that can say something more substantial about this. It has been too much classification, too much definition, and too little on processes, how this has developed, in my opinion. Today, we are delivering a proposal for building a center of excellence called the institutions, social capital and active citizenship, the social sustainability of the Nordic model. We don't know, of course, if we get the money, but even if we don't get the money, we will start a Nordic project on this. We will go on, try to improve our understanding. What's it all about? It's about the social mechanism in which welfare and civil society institutions, social norms and trust, and political and civic behavior, how they sustain each other. And this is not very well understood, in my opinion. What I'm going to say today, concentrate on, is the title. I will say a little bit on this common understanding of that the Nordic model is actually a social democratic model. I think it's a non-starter. It doesn't help us understand what has been going on, how it has all developed, and it, in a way, stops the thinking, the interest in the processes that has been going on and that we see the result of today. So what's wrong with it? Of course, I can't really answer it today, and I can just give you a short, I wouldn't say an introduction, but just give you some thoughts about some problems with this understanding. And the main problem is, in my opinion, that it doesn't take into account the role of civil society. What is civil society all about? What's going on there? And how does it influence policy making, political decisions that has long-term consequences? So let's start with 2 or 3 things connected to that. First of all, the main structure of the Nordic civil society, of the Scandinavian civil society, was there before the development of social democracy. A lot of these, what we can call collectivist-oriented social movements, from the late or mid-19th century, they were there before social democracy grew, or at least at the same time. And they have had an impact on the way we organize, at least until 10, 20 years ago. By that I mean the organizational model of the 1880s, 1890s. We had that model with us, and it was totally dominant until at least the late 60s, and it's still of great importance. It was a way to integrate, I think. It was a hierarchical model, and it was a political model. I'll say a little bit more about both. First of all, you had a tremendous growth in organizations from the late 18th century. And they were more or less all of them political in character. So they tried to influence the direction of society. This is very important. Our whole civil society, as I said, the organized part of the civil society, was mainly political, at least until the 70s. Furthermore, you had the same types of organizations at the local, regional, and national level. And this is a very strong model of integration. And of course, this goes on parallel to the democratization process of Norway or even nation building. So this is very important for the development of our society. And again, I will not go into detail here, but just emphasis that the whole structure of this, the whole model, is there before social democracy is up and going. So then we have a model, a way of organizing that becomes entrenched. Everybody later on who started to build a voluntary organization, started to build a social movement, they choose this model. That was the way of organizing, whether you needed it or not. What was going on within this civil society, this broadly organized society that tried to influence public policy? And how much social democracy was in there? Well, that, nobody has answered that. That's not really research. And I'll come up with some ideas, I think, not conclusions, but at least hypotheses around that. And especially, I will concentrate on what we could call the welfare field. You see, and to me this is interesting, because I think there is an intimate relationship between civil society organization and what's going on in politics and political parties all the time, like in the US. Fully agree on that perspective. But what you see then is that those organizations that really had a huge membership base and were great institution builders within the welfare field, even building huge hospitals in this country, they were not, I should say, at all coming from the labor movement. And as late as in the late 30s, the labor movement itself started to see that there was something lacking in their organizational landscape, so to see, namely strong organizations within the welfare field. So we built such an organization, and they did, just before the war, Norsk Folkehjelp, that never became an organization of the same strength as some of the others, even so, and got their new, become strong when foreign aid developed, actually. So, if you look at how welfare arrangements develops, we have to look at the ideas on welfare that were going on within these huge organizations that we are talking about. And I should tell you that just one of them, Norske Kvinners Sanitetsforening, an organization only for women, in the mid-60s had around 270,000 members in a population of less than 3.5 million at that time. These organizations were everywhere, in the inner fjords, everywhere. You see them in local communities. And they built strong organizations at the central level. Did these organizations have any ideas about how to develop our welfare society? Of course they had. They had very strong ideas about that. They were political organizations. These women organizations were coming from the party, the left party, which had strong ideas about how to develop the welfare state. So in the process, and we don't know enough about this, in the process, when social democracy, then the Social Democratic Party, starts to dominate as a political party and trying to build the state, so to speak, because we didn't have that much of a state between, when it comes to money at least, and services before the war. Who should they cooperate with? Who should they talk to? What? Of course, these organizations. They were the ones that were there, and they had ideas about how to do things. I should give you an example. As late as in the late 50s, these organizations are setting up what we today, I think, would define as corporate arrangement, in which they are leading these institutions, inviting governmental bodies in. Not like corporatist arrangements later on, where the government, of course, are setting up these institutions and then invite private actors, civil society organizations in to cooperate with them. And when it comes to the elderly, that we talk quite a lot about here, ideas about how to organize this, because that came up during the 50s. When it comes to the cancer question, when it comes to lung and heart diseases, these are organizations where the organizations there, they were the one doing the job, because there were not that much public services at all, and not much of public responsibility either. So here you have a very interesting relationship between, I would say, politics, party politics, and what's going on within these organizations. And of course, they were also great service providers, and this is very often forgotten when people from on the outside of Scandinavia or outside of the Nordic countries are looking looking at us. They think that, no, we didn't have that kind of stuff. But of course we had. And one of the puzzling thing here that is very difficult, for, at least for me, to understand is when we had these big organizations with all these clever people, very good organizers, how come that they developed this ideology saying that what we are doing actually is a public responsibility? We are doing it, and this is different, I think, at least partly different from what was going on in the US and in many countries at the continent. They developed this idea. We go for the universal solution. What we are doing is for everybody in this country. And we want the state to take the responsibility. And we don't necessarily see it as a big problem if the state is taking over our institutions. It depends on how they behave when they do that, and there's been a lot of discussions on that, but that's another type of question. So why did they develop this kind of universal idea? You see, the idea that universalism is coming from social democracy, that's not true. Universalism was not coming in this country from the Social Democratic parties. The Communist Party, that was also rather big in periods, they were strongly against all kinds of universal arrangements. And most of the Labour Party were also against it. Why were they against it? Because we don't have that much money, and why should we use money on people that can take care of themselves? We should use the money on ourselves. And remember that these corporate arrangements from the late 50s. A long time ago, you think. But remember that the institutionalization of the Norwegian welfare state, for instance, is 1967. So it's very close up to the implementation, really, of the welfare state. And of course these organizations had the same. Of course they had ideas that were used in these political processes when we try to decide how to organize this welfare state. What I'm saying here is, of course, not that social democracy, the Labour Party, has been without any influence. Of course they have had an influence on what has been going on. But one interesting research question, I think, is actually to try to understand to what extent and how did this tradition that I'm just talking a little bit about here influence the party as such, their way of thinking, how they, over a very short period of time when they got responsibility for the state, developed a very different way of looking at the state as compared to when they were in opposition. This went very fast. And this universal arrangement was, of course, a part that is a defining characteristic of the Nordic or the Scandinavian welfare state, was, of course, a result of negotiations, of political discussions among the different parties that have different connections to these huge social movements, these huge welfare organizations that we are talking about here. So then, time is running fast, so then a puzzle you have to go into here, I think. Social democracy is, of course, in this respect, when it comes to the welfare state, is two different things. First of all, we know that they got the political power, which means that they are a main decision maker over a long period of time. And in that period, of course, they make decisions that is building this welfare system. But that doesn't mean that we as scholars automatically should say that these are this is social democracy, they are building the welfare state. Because the power, the strength of civil society is very important here, I think. And the other part of it is this. The Social Democrats, or the labor movement, of course, is also a political movement in itself, building their own organizations, specialized sports, culture, what have you. And of course, in certain parts of the country, they were very important, especially in part of some of the big cities and in the east of this country. Yes, of course, there was a lot going on in civil society coming from the labor movement. But if you move to other parts of the country, they were not dominating at all. They played a marginal role in civil society. A marginal role in civil society. It was what we perhaps could call a kind of a Christian humanitarian tradition that dominated in the welfare field. And that they dominated at least until the late 60s in this area. And that has consequences for the development of the welfare state and how it became institutionalized. At least I think that's a very interesting and important hypothesis. And it goes against, you see, this understanding. And I say a little bit also on that. How much time do you have left? Nothing. 5 minutes? Yeah. 2 minutes. If we then look at, there is a complicated relationship here between civil society and politics, political parties, and who's deciding what. And we have to divide, at least, the social democratic movement between being in government and looking upon it as a movement, and what kind of strength do we see there. And that's not that impressive. And that must mean something. If we then go back to looking at this more overall model and end with that again, whether some will call it social democratic or not, I think to call it social democratic is a misuse of concepts. So I think also this, even if one continues with this classification, typologies, the Nordic, to say that the Nordic model is a social democratic model is simply superficial, it's simply wrong. We should stop doing it immediately. Because it stops thinking. That's why I'm saying it's not that I have anything against social democracy in itself. But it has to do with this classification. You classify like this, you find these concepts, and you say, oh, no, we have got it. Now we understand what it's all about. We don't. We don't understand what it's all about. It's much more to be done on this topic. And I will end with this crowding out discussion, which is very important. I was part of this Hopkins project. I'll say a couple of words about that. Of course, it was framed in at least in the beginning, in a very American setting, and a strong emphasis on employment and these kind of ideas. But it has been very important for this debate on crowding out. And why? Well, the main reason, of course, you have the World Values Survey and European surveys, and you see people answer this, and we are a member of that. But what this project is doing, and more than 40 countries, part of it, is that they look at what's actually there of civil society organizations. And also for those Americans that were in charge of this project, become surprised, of course, because they were influenced by the Anglo-Saxon understanding of the state model, these ideas of crowding out, the economic theories on incentives that said that where the government is going in, the others are leaving. When it comes, whatever measure you look for, when it comes to defining social capital, trust, volume of the voluntary sector, differentiation of the voluntary sector, the Nordic countries are on top of it all, together with Netherlands in many of these cases, on top of it. So those countries that have the most extensive welfare state have the most extensive civil society. And since I'm out of time, I'll end with the social welfare organizations, you see. Because one of the things that, of course, is happening is that when state is going in, dominating the educational and the welfare, hospital sector, whatever, of course that has influence for how you organize your civil society. I'm not saying that it's without any influence. Of course it is. It has something to do with where you put your energy. But if you compare Europe, even volunteering in the welfare field, well, and we don't have today that broad organizations. Well, we have, but they have been declining. even within the welfare area, volunteering in Norway is higher than in any other European country, which is, I would say, a strong empirical case for that a lot of this crowding out perspectives are not worth the paper they are written on. Thank you.